The loudest man in the room is rarely the most powerful. He's just the most predictable. The man with real power doesn't fight for attention. He lets others speak first, not because he's unsure, but because he's watching. Every word they say is a map of their fears, their alliances, their desperation to be seen. He speaks last, and only when the silence becomes unbearable. Because timing isn't etiquette. It's strategy. Steve Jobs didn't rush the iPhone announcement. He paused. He let the world sit in silence, leaning in, waiting. Then he spoke, and reality shifted. That's not charisma. That's precision, a Machiavellian principle in action. Reveal nothing until the moment makes you untouchable. But there's a deeper reason they wait. It's not just strategy. It's self-mastery. Carl Jung believed that compulsive speech is a symptom of unresolved chaos within. But the man who can hold his voice, the man who resists the urge to prove, explain, or react, has already conquered something far greater than an argument. He's conquered himself. And when such a man finally speaks, people don't just hear him, they feel him. Because in a world addicted to noise, the man who controls his silence becomes the most unforgettable voice in the room. The man who speaks first exposes himself. The man who waits watches everyone else do it. In politics, war, and high-stakes negotiation, the first one to talk almost always loses. Because the moment you open your mouth, you reveal where you stand, your beliefs, your insecurities, your desperation to gain ground. The powerful, they give you rope, enough for you to hang your position, without them ever having to reveal theirs. This is not about being passive. It's about being strategic, because silence is not the absence of speech. It's a trap. Machiavelli wrote in his discourses, "Men are so simple and so obedient to present necessities that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived." In modern life, the deception doesn't need to be active. It happens the moment you let someone else reveal too much, too soon, and all you did was listen. The moment they try to dominate the room with words, they become visible, predictable, vulnerable. And when your turn comes, you don't speak to match them, you speak to end them. Silence is not absence. It's pressure, and pressure reveals what performance hides. In every conversation, there's an invisible negotiation happening, not about facts, but about power. The moment you remove yourself from the verbal race, when you stop trying to prove, explain, justify, something unexpected happens. You force the other person to carry the tension. Carl Jung once wrote, "The reason for evil in the world is that people are not able to tell their stories." But he didn't mean you should speak constantly. He meant that when people can't tolerate inner silence, they become addicted to outer noise. And that addiction? It makes them reckless. Here's the truth. Most people talk because they're uncomfortable with what happens when they don't. They fear the silence between stimulus and response, because in that gap, the unconscious speaks. You, on the other hand, when you choose to withhold your voice, not from fear but from centered awareness, you transfer the psychic burden onto the room. You say, "I will not ease your discomfort. I will not fill this space for you." And the longer you hold it, the more their unconscious begins to project. They fill your silence with meaning. They wonder what you're thinking. They begin to doubt themselves. They try harder, talk faster, explain more than necessary. All you did was sit back, and suddenly they gave you the blueprint to their entire psychological system. Machiavelli would smile. Because that's not just psychological insight. That's leverage. When you speak, the ego leads. When you wait, the unconscious responds. Jung's theory of the shadow tells us that we all carry a hidden part of ourselves, a reservoir of fear, doubt, resentment, inferiority. But that shadow isn't always visible, especially when we're in control of our image, when we're on. Words, then, become tools of disguise. They let us curate our identity. But silence? Silence does something terrifying. It strips away the mask, not instantly, but slowly. When you remain still in a conversation, the other person begins to feel something unsettling. Invisibility. They're not being affirmed. They're not being mirrored. They're not being controlled. And the ego hates that. It needs feedback. It needs to dominate the tempo. It needs to know that it still exists by hearing its echo in others. So what does it do? It overcompensates. The ego tries to fill the vacuum with more and more words. It floods the space with affirmations, arguments, noise, and in that flood, you see what they normally keep hidden. Their fear of being ignored, their craving for approval, their obsession with appearing smart, their weakness in needing validation. This is the psychological gold Jung spoke of, because it's only when someone is stripped of control that their true shadow leaks out. And as you sit in silence, calm, composed, untouchable, you're not just holding space. You're conducting a deep psychological excavation. You've turned the room into a mirror, and everyone else can't look away from their own reflection. Machiavelli didn't talk about shadows, but he understood what happens when others lose composure in front of you. Men should either be treated generously or destroyed because they take revenge for slight injuries, but cannot do so for severe ones. What's more severe than someone seeing who you are beneath your mask and saying nothing? That kind of psychological pressure is not easily forgotten, nor forgiven. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. The purpose of holding silence is not to appear wise. It's to let the mask fall before you strike. Now, let's be clear. Silence isn't enough. You don't just wait forever. You wait for the fracture. The moment someone overextends, says too much, reveals too far, pleads for agreement, that's when you strike. And when you do, you don't attack them personally. You simply reframe the conversation with surgical precision. You drop a single sentence, unshakable, stripped of emotion, grounded in presence, and it cuts through the fog like steel. Because here's what happens when you speak after they've unraveled themselves. You don't need to defend. They've already lost control. You don't need to argue. Their position is self-defeating. You don't need to prove anything. Your restraint proved it already. Your words land not because they're loud, but because they're inevitable. That's the art of the Machiavellian pause. It's the strategy of strategic absence, followed by precise intervention. Jung would describe it not as manipulation, but as the behavior of an integrated self. A self that no longer reacts to every provocation. A self that doesn't need the last word, because it creates the final word. And in that moment, you aren't just the most composed person in the room. You become the axis the room begins to rotate around, not by force, not by volume, but by psychological gravity. People remember what ends the conversation, not what filled it. There's a strange trick the brain plays during every interaction. We remember the last impactful thing we hear, not the noise that came before it. In psychology, it's called the recency effect. In power, it's called tactical timing. Think of a courtroom. The prosecution lays out their case. They rant, stack evidence, drive emotion. But then the defense attorney stands, calm, collected, and says one thing that reframes the entire case. A quiet fact, a single contradiction, a moment of truth that wipes out the chaos before it. And the jury? They forget the fire. They remember the final cut. Powerful people know this. They don't aim to be heard through the noise. They let the noise die on its own. Then they speak after the dust settles. Why? Because the mind can't process layered noise. It seeks closure, resolution, simplicity. And when someone speaks after everyone else has exhausted themselves, they become the anchor the conversation subconsciously seeks. You don't need to out-talk people. You only need to outlast their chaos and deliver clarity at the exact moment clarity becomes oxygen. Machiavelli wrote, The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. Timing, then, is how you manipulate appearances. You don't rush to be impressive. You wait until everyone needs direction. And when you speak, your words feel like commandments, not opinions. The strongest presence in the room is the one that controls rhythm, not volume. This is the secret most motivational speakers miss. Powerful speech isn't about what you say. It's when you say it, and what came before it. Carl Jung believed that transformation only happens when the psyche is destabilized, when the ego structure begins to crack and can no longer pretend to be in control. That's why true impact doesn't come from rehearsed delivery. It comes from intuitive timing, sensing the exact moment when people are ready to hear something they didn't expect. That moment is rare. It only comes when the noise has peaked, the egos have clashed, the audience is hungry for order. You can't fake that moment, but you can orchestrate it by holding your presence like a metronome. Don't try to dominate the tempo. Let it swing wild. Let the room lose its balance. And when the moment hits, you interrupt the pattern, not the person. Your words become the reset button. A sigh of relief, a shift in direction, a break in the tension that nobody realized they were craving. This is how you bend reality, not by force, but by framing the end of the cycle. Machiavelli used to stage emotional spectacles before negotiations, not to distract, but to dilute the other's clarity. Then he would pause, withdraw, and return when the confusion calcified, to offer a solution they couldn't resist. That's timing. And it's lethal. People don't follow the smartest voice. They follow the one that speaks after the storm. Picture a battlefield. Swords clashing, screams everywhere. No one knows what's happening. Then, silence. One man walks across the field. He raises a single flag. And everyone, exhausted, bloodied, confused, turns toward him. Not because he's the strongest, but because he's the first to bring stillness. This is what timing does in communication. You don't fight to be heard in the middle of chaos. You wait until the energy collapses, and you offer a new structure. People crave psychological certainty, and they will instinctively submit to the voice that restores it. This is why the man who speaks first rarely becomes the leader. The man who speaks last, with clarity, is perceived as the natural authority. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But in the silence after a verbal storm, the soul surfaces. That's when people are open. That's when transformation becomes possible. And if you are the one who speaks into that vulnerability, you shape their entire memory of the moment. In relationships, in business, in politics, in war. The last word is not just about timing. It's about ownership. You're not trying to win the argument. You're trying to own the emotional conclusion. And when you do that, you don't need to say much, because they will repeat your words for you. Power doesn't belong to the one who knows the answer. It belongs to the one who controls the moment the answer is given. Most people live in reaction mode. They answer instantly. They explain themselves before being asked. They defend when no one's attacking. They give away timing, and with it, they give away control. Let's take a common scenario. Someone challenges you in a meeting. The average person reacts immediately. They defend. They overtalk. They try to prove their intelligence in real time. But a powerful person? They pause. They let the room lean into the discomfort. They let the challenge hang. Then, and only then, they respond. Calm, centered, precise. That pause doesn't just buy them time. It signals something far deeper. I decide when my voice enters this room, not you. Machiavelli understood this game long before corporate boardrooms existed. He once advised rulers to control the tempo of court. not by commanding people's words, but by mastering when and how they respond. He knew that the appearance of control was often stronger than control itself. Carl Jung echoed this in another dimension. He believed most people react not to external events, but to internal wounds triggered by those events. That's why instant response often isn't strategic. It's psychological bleeding. So here's a simple rule. If your mouth moves before your breath slows down, you're not speaking from power. You're leaking from insecurity. To reclaim your timing is to reclaim your psychic center, because power is not in what you say. It's in your ability to choose the exact second to say it, and no sooner. The man who appears passive is often just conserving ammunition. Silence scares people, especially in daily interactions, small talk, arguments, business negotiations. Why? Because silence is ambiguous, and humans fear what they can't categorize. But here's the secret most people miss. You can say 80% less and still dominate 100% of the interaction. It's not about volume. It's about environmental positioning. Let's say someone gives you a compliment, but it feels loaded, manipulative. The typical response? Deflect it. Over-explain. Try to clarify intentions. But a Machiavellian mind knows the real response is to let the compliment rot in the silence. You smile, maybe, or say nothing. Now the burden is on them. They scramble, they explain, they adjust. That's not passivity. That's a power inversion. Silence doesn't mean you're losing. It means you're turning the space into a mirror and letting them confront themselves. Jung would say this is where projection collapses, because when the other person can't read you, they're forced to meet themselves, their own insecurity, their own manipulation, their own hunger for validation. You become the psychological terrain, and they lose their footing on it. Everyday power is built in these micro moments, moments where you could speak, but don't, where you could react, but observe instead, where you wait until they show you everything you need to know. Then, when the moment is ripe, you deliver one sentence that rewrites the entire scene. You're not being quiet. You're constructing leverage. Powerful speech isn't loud or fast. It's surgical, irrefutable, and final. Once you've mastered timing, the next move is intentionality. You don't speak to participate. You speak to alter. The mistake most people make after holding silence is this. They break it with a flood of words. But power doesn't need many words. It needs one cut. Clean, deep, and irreversible. Imagine you're in a conflict. Everyone is talking over each other, accusing, deflecting, proving. You wait. Then you say, "All I know is this. The facts don't support that story." That's it. You didn't attack. You didn't emote. You cut. And now, everyone has to recalibrate. That sentence becomes the new reference point. Not because it was brilliant, but because it was perfectly placed. Carl Jung taught that language carries archetypal energy. A well-timed sentence, if spoken from self-mastery, enters the unconscious of everyone in the room. It lingers. It reshapes interpretation. It haunts. Machiavelli would call this speaking like a prince. Sparse, but loaded with consequence. You don't want people to remember everything you said. You want them to remember they said too much. And you didn't have to. You want them to feel that your words ended the room's confusion and left something in the air they can't undo. That is power through timing. That is dominance without aggression. And that is how you win not just the conversation, but the internal narrative of everyone who heard it. He who controls his pace controls perception, and perception is power. Every day you're pushed to answer faster, react quicker, perform on cue. The pressure is constant. Instant replies, constant validation, speed as a signal of intelligence. But here's the truth. The powerful know. Speed is often just disguised fear. The fear of being left behind. The fear of seeming unprepared. The fear of silence being misinterpreted. But real power doesn't chase time. It slows it down. Jung would say, hurry is not of the soul. Machiavelli would say, appear patient. Conceal urgency. Move only when the outcome has already shifted. The man who doesn't rush doesn't just appear confident. He appears inevitable. Because everyone else is reacting to the moment. But he waits until the moment belongs to him. And when he moves, he doesn't just speak. He ends the noise. When the room begins to change just because you're silent, that's presence. The final evolution of timing isn't verbal, it's energetic. You walk into a room, you don't smile, you don't speak, you don't perform. But people sense something shift. They adjust. They monitor. They wonder what you think. Why? Because your silence is anchored. It's not empty. It's charged. That's what Jung would call the individuated self. A person so internally integrated that they no longer need social cues to feel grounded. They walk into noise and become the stillness everyone didn't know they craved. Their restraint forces others to hear themselves. Their timing doesn't just enter the room, it reshapes it. Machiavelli understood this not as mysticism, but as tactic. The ruler who rarely speaks becomes a myth. The one who withholds becomes magnified, not because they're trying to be powerful, but because they've ceased being available for power games. They are power. The goal is not to speak last. The goal is to make every word feel like it couldn't have been spoken by anyone else. There's a moment in every room, a pivot, a beat where everything slows, a space opens, everyone looks around. That's your moment. But only if you've held the silence long enough, only if you've let the noise burn out, only if you've mastered the self enough to say, now, I will move. Not because you were forced to, not because they demanded it, but because you waited until your presence could not be ignored. That's not charisma. That's not extroversion. That's spiritual precision. Carl Jung called this the integration of shadow and self, where nothing you say is performance. It's revelation. Machiavelli didn't speak of the soul, but he knew the principle. Let your enemies miscalculate. Let your allies underestimate. Let the room forget you until you become the room. And when you do, your voice doesn't just inform, it ends the conversation. Most men speak too soon because they fear being forgotten. But the unforgettable are silent until it's time to strike. If you've ever felt the urge to speak just to stay visible, understand this. Visibility is cheap. Presence is expensive. And the currency you use to buy it is restraint. You don't have to dominate every conversation. You don't need to be loud, flashy, or convincing. You only need to do 3 things. Hold the silence others run from. Time your voice like a blade. Let the world recalibrate to your stillness. Speak less. Wait longer. Strike deeper. Because in a world of reaction, you become unignorable not by speaking more, but by speaking perfectly. If this video shifted something in you, you're not alone. You've just seen how Carl Jung's shadow mastery and Machiavelli's political strategy combine into one lethal skill: psychological timing. Subscribe for more faceless, high-intensity videos like this, built on depth, darkness, and dominance. Comment below. I don't speak to be heard. I speak to be remembered. Welcome to the 1%. We don't make noise. We become the atmosphere.